Skholar, your one-stop solution for IAS preparation. Students, my name is Anubhav Sharma and I am your faculty for Indian Polity. Now, students, in our module number 1 and module number 2, we have discussed few basic things about Indian Constitution and we have also discussed about what exactly do we mean by democracy. In this module, we will be understanding some of the basic things that we need to know with respect to parliamentary system of government, which in fact is the system of government which we practice in India. Let me again repeat that the first three modules that we have covered has been sourced directly from NCERT and is very important for us to prepare for our prelims examination for the simple reason that a standard book like Lakshmikant is not doing justice to these parts, while when we look at prelims exam, a question based on these three chapters are often found. Thus, this again is very important for you to note. So let's get on with our lecture. So the first thing that we need to understand is what exactly do we mean by parliamentary system? What is parliamentary system? Look, we have talked about democracy, we have talked about democratic government. When we look around the world, different kind of polities, what we essentially see is that when we talk about democratic government, there are two basic forms that we see. The first is parliamentary system and the other is presidential system. What exactly is the difference between the two? Simply put, the difference is between how exactly the relationship between legislature, the organ, and executive, the organ exists. In presidential system, it is absolutely separated, while in parliamentary system, the system is such that the executive is actually taken from the legislature. We will study about that in detail in this module itself, right? So as we discussed, there are two types of democratic governments in modern political system, and the basis on which we classify them is based on the nature of relationship between executive and legislative organs, right? The parliamentary government that we are trying to understand here is also known as cabinet government, responsible government, and Westminster model of government, which is prevalent in countries like Britain, Japan, Canada, and India. Why exactly parliamentary system is called as cabinet government? We will study that in this module itself, but let me just give you a brief explanation to this, that essentially in a parliamentary government, what happens is that the government is made up of ministers which are taken from the legislature itself, right? These ministers are responsible for their respective ministries and are answerable to the legislature, they are answerable to the prime minister. The most important ministries forms the cabinet, and this cabinet propels the direction in which the executive will work. This is slightly different from that of presidential system, where essentially what we see is that there is one president who becomes the head of the executive. Thus, what we see that in parliamentary system, it is the cabinet which is driving the course of parliament, which is driving the course of executive functioning. As such, parliamentary system is also called cabinet government. I hope this point is also clear. Another point for you to remember is that in countries like Britain, Japan, Canada, and of course India, it is this parliamentary system which is being followed. Now, when we talk about presidential government, what we see that it is also known as non-parliamentary system or fixed executive system. Why exactly is it called fixed executive system? The reason is very simple, that the moment you have elected your president, this president is now the executive, this president is the head of the executive. But when we talk about a system like that in India, that is parliamentary system, it may very well be that the executive is getting changed. That is, it may very well be that someone who is today the Minister of Home Affairs, his ministry might be taken away and that person might be allocated some other ministry. That we see a lot in recent times, right? Thus, what we see is that when we talk about presidential system, it will be the president who will be the head of the executive. He will be controlling everything. He can appoint someone. He can make someone to resign from the post. There, they call it as secretaries of the department. Like there is a secretary for defense in India. In parliamentary system, we call it minister of that department. This point again will become more clearer as we go along in this lecture series. Then Some of the examples of presidential government: USA, Brazil, Russia, Sri Lanka. Again, something that if you remember and if you are able to write in the exam will be a reason why you will be given more marks, mainly in your mains exam. This brings us to the second part: how exactly does a parliamentary system work? Now, it is pretty straightforward. We just need to understand the logic. We have discussed that in any democracy, it will be the people who will elect their representative. The so happens in parliamentary system of government or democracy. It will be the people who would elect their representatives to the parliament. When these people have been elected, essentially, who exactly are we electing? We are electing our legislators. They become the part of Lok Sabha. When they have become the part of Lok Sabha, there will be groups with among them. The groups is what we call as parties. The party which will be able to garner the majority in the House will have the privilege of forming the government. For example, right now we have BJP ruled government. Why exactly BJP was able to form a government? The reason is the number of members required for them is more than 50% of the strength of the House, and that is why they can form the government. So essentially, what we see that the people of India elected their legislators. These legislators go to Lok Sabha. At Lok Sabha, they decide who exactly has maximum number of people. The party which is able to garner more than 50% of the seats will be able to form the government. This government is what we call as executive. That is, when we have elected the legislators, among legislators, executive gets formed. As such, we are indirectly electing our executives. We are directly electing our legislators. Again, this is a point that you can keep in mind, right? The parliament is made up of all representatives. Together, it controls and guides the government. The fact that there is a government which has been formed on the basis of majority doesn't mean that the role of the legislators have ended, the role of the parliament has ended. Parliament is required for different functions which needs to be done in capacity of one being a legislator. For example, if you want to pass a bill, there are certain bills which require 50% of the majority. There are certain bills like constitutional amendment which requires special kind of majority. In all those functions, you would need parliament to play a very important role, legislators to play a very important role, and the role is not limited to that of only government, but all legislators as such. Another way in which Parliament is playing a very important role is by controlling the government. Now, you may wonder how exactly Parliament is able to control the government. Well, it controls it by forming parliamentary committees. It controls it by the proceedings of the parliament, like question hour. It also controls it with respect to formation of budget, with respect to transparency in terms of audit report being filed to the parliamentary committees. As such, we see that the role of legislators is not just to legislate laws, but also to check the functioning of the government, to control the actions of the government. This point again, I believe, is clear. In a parliamentary system, people choose the representative, and through them they form the government. A point that we just covered. Now, what is the role of parliament in parliamentary system? The point that we were just discussing. Parliament has an important role of making laws. As we know that in order to make laws, parliament would need to pass that bill. In order to pass that bill, there needs to be a majority of the people voting for the bill. When that happens, law gets made. We will also study about the lawmaking process in detail when we study about parliament chapter, right? Different groups in society raise the need for a particular law, and parliament has to be sensitive to the problems of the people. This again is a very important thing for us to understand, that essentially what we are seeking from our representatives, from our parliamentarians, is to understand what exactly society is seeking, what all types of laws society is in need of. For example, one of the things that we had discussed in our last module was with respect to Nirbhaya. What exactly had happened? There was a brutal rape that was committed. People were able to convince, people were able to put pressure on their elected representatives to pass a law which is very stringent against those who are committing such a heinous crime like rape. And that is exactly what happened. The same can be said with respect to Lokpal law, that it was the people who were pressing the issue, and eventually we saw that Lokpal getting formed. In the same way, there are other issues on which there could be difference of opinion, and government would need to, or rather, parliament would need to understand the sensibilities involved. For example, the triple talaq bill, which was formulated by the government, there was a section which was criticizing it, there was another section which was supporting it, and it was the duty of the legislators to decide where exactly the pulse of the people lies, what exactly are the sensitivities involved in the legislation, and accordingly legislate the law. I hope you are able to understand what I'm trying to explain in this part. This again brings us to the second aspect of it. What is the role of citizens in a parliamentary system? While we have said that citizens are the one who are electing their representatives, but does that mean the role of a citizen in a parliamentary system ends after election of their representatives? Certainly it cannot be. Citizens raise concerns raised by them and help Parliament in framing concerns into laws. I just gave you a few examples with respect to this point. Secondly, voice of citizens is crucial at all stages of formulation of law. For example, in recent times, a law which was being brought by the government and which in fact got enacted was Citizenship Act, right? The Citizenship Amendment Act (CAA) was being criticized by a good section of people. What exactly did that do? It made government to reconsider the law to an extent, and what we know for certainty that government right now has tabled NRC law and it will not be raising it in near future. Thus, the in the process of enacting CAA, people were able to register their dissent with respect to the law. This made the government to reconsider the law, and what we saw that at least NRC was not tabled. In the same way, there was a law which wanted to reverse one of the judgments of Supreme Court, which had disallowed the parliamentarians who have been convicted by any court of law to continue as member of parliament. With respect to that too, people had shown great degree of dissent to the approach of the government, to the approach of the parliamentarians who wanted to reverse the decision of the Supreme Court. In that respect also, government, the parliamentarians had to heed to the opinion of the people and they had to check their course. What exactly have we understood? That while we have given our powers to the legislators to legislate laws, to make laws, that doesn't mean that we have surrendered our whole powers to them. What it only means is that you are now responsible to make those laws which we are seeking. At the same time, we will always keep on engaging ourselves in the parliamentary process by raising our voice on the issues, on the bills which Parliament is bringing or should be bringing. I hope this point is also clear. TV reports, newspaper editorials, radio broadcasts, local meetings act as a medium to channel the voice of citizens. Again, we know we have something called Article 19 in Indian Constitution, which speaks about freedom of expression. Within that, we have a judgment of Romesh Thapar where Supreme Court has said that circulation of media, that is media rights, freedom of media is also a part of Article 19 for the reason that it is only then information can be propagated among people and people can express their opinions. Because having opinion is one thing, but being able to express is absolutely different. As such, the Supreme Court wants to protect your ability to express opinion. In that respect, we need to understand that people express their opinion by different ways. It could be social groups, social media, but the conventional way in which people are registering their opinion is TV reports, newspaper editorials, radio broadcasts, local meetings, etc. I hope this point is also clear. They also help in making parliament more accessible and transparent to the people because when media is asking questions to the parliament, media is asking questions to the government, what we see that government will need to be responsive towards it. Government will need to find right answers which can satisfy the curiosity of the people. This again makes them more responsive. This makes them more accountable. The extent and involvement enthusiasm of the people helps parliament perform its representative functions properly. This is what we call as a vibrant democracy. In a vibrant democracy, what we require is that there is a sense, a spirit of democracy among the people, that people themselves want to be a participant in the the structure of democracy. They want to participate in local administration. They would want to participate in municipal administration. They would want to participate in the things which are happening with respect to state government, the bills the state government is passing. For example, Jallikattu issue. Then we also had Sabrimala issue. So there were issues where people wanted to voice their opinion. In the same way, we have people who would want central government to take some decisions. This is what we call as a vibrant democracy, where it's not just the representative, that is the elected representatives, but also people at large who are participating in the polity, in the discourse of how our democratic values are getting manifested in the laws that are getting made. I hope this point is clear. Why is the parliamentary system also known as cabinet system? This again could be a question that might be coming in your mind, that why exactly do we call as cabinet system? Now, I have touched upon that briefly in the initial part of this lecture. Let me just reiterate myself. So essentially what we have understood is that in a parliamentary form of government, it will be the legislators among whom the executive will be made, that is the government will be made. What exactly is government? Government is those respective ministries where executive decision making can be done and policies made by the legislators can be implemented. So what have we done? We have classified those departments which can be qualified as a ministry. So we have Ministry of Home Affairs, which is broadly responsible for law and order administration in pan-India basis for national security, right? We also have Defense Ministry, which is important for national security and the border disputes that we have, the war, so on and so forth, our defense preparedness. We have something called Agricultural Ministry, which is responsible for ensuring that agriculture in our India, that economic sector where more than 50% of the people are dependent on, that sector is functioning in a well fashioned manner. We also have Finance Ministry. So essentially what we are seeing is that what we have done is to divide the issues of governance into certain divisions. For every division, what we have done is to make a minister. And now the collection of these ministers will decide upon the executive decision making and the direction in which the country would need to move. Among these ministers will be some ministers which are very important. For example, defense minister certainly is very, very important. Information technology minister is very important. Home minister is very, very important. Agriculture minister is very, very important. HRD minister is very important. So these important ministries forms the cabinet. This cabinet will be collection of those important ministers, which will be headed by the Prime Minister of India, and all of them collectively will deliberate upon executive functioning. As such, one can clearly call it to be the nucleus of the government, because the direction of this government will not be decided by all the legislators who are part of that government, that is the party of that government. For example, in BJP, we know there are more than 280 members in the parliament, right? But all of them are not ministers. But it is not all of these 280 members who are responsible for taking executive actions. It is only those ministers which the party has decided to be the ministers who will be deciding the course of decision making. As such, what we see that at the nucleus of executive, we have the cabinet. Thus, cabinet is considered as the nucleus of power in parliamentary system. The cabinet is also the real executive that is accountable to the parliament, again, which is a point which is very, very easy to understand, that it is cabinet which is the real executive and it is accountable to the parliament. Parliament will have a question to the minister of any department and that minister will need to reply in that question hour. I hope this point is clear. Thus, it is responsible for the parliament for all its actions. Then there is a political scientist called Ivor Jennings, and he writes that in parliamentary system, cabinet system is I mean parliamentary system can also be called as cabinet system because cabinet is the nucleus of power in parliamentary system. So when you quote name of a very important personnel with respect to polity and political thinkers, Ivor Jennings is very, very important because of his study on Indian Constitution. And whenever you are able to bring a point which was raised by Ivor Jennings, it will always increase the value of your answer. It will always get you some more marks. Again, a point that you can remember. Cabinet stays in the office so long as it enjoys the confidence of the parliament. So the confidence of the parliament is necessary for the cabinet to be in power. What exactly are we trying to say? Simply put, as we have discussed, for any party to claim their power, to claim their claim on the government, they would need to show that they have more than 50% of the parliamentarians supporting them. So, if there are less than 50% of the people who are supporting them, in other words, more than 50% of the parliamentarians do not have confidence in the government will fall, and that is something that we have witnessed with respect to coalition government. In fact, in recent times, we are witnessing the same with respect to Madhya Pradesh, with respect to Rajasthan, that in legislative assembly, government is finding it very hard to prove its majority. As such, it is finding it very hard to show that it enjoys the confidence of the legislative assembly. In Madhya Pradesh, we saw it happened, and the government, Congress-led government, was removed, and the new BJP-led government is now in power. Something of similar seems to be happening right now in Rajasthan during the time when I was recording this lecture. Now, what all are the advantages of parliamentary system? We need to understand all the advantages of parliamentary system, and let's go and understand them one by one, right? So the first advantage is there is cooperation between legislature and executive in a parliamentary system of government. Now, one thing that we know for certainty, that be it presidential system or for that matter parliamentary system, we have legislature and we also have executive. But there is a difference in the nature of engagement of executive and legislature in both systems. While in presidential system, what we see that executive is completely divorced, completely separated from that of legislature. As such, what happens that the idea of coordination between executive and legislature may not always be possible for the reason because they are absolutely separated. But when we talk about parliamentary system, what exactly do we see? What we see is that essentially people are electing their legislators, and among themselves, the party with majority number of the house of the members, will be forming the government. As such, the executive is being taken from the legislature itself. Thus, the degree of coordination that we would see in parliamentary system between these two organs will be more than the degree of coordination in the presidential form. I hope this point is also clear. Why exactly the coordination between legislature and executive is high when we talk about parliamentary system as compared to the coordination in presidential system. In presidential system, it is separate, while in parliamentary system, the executives are taken from and among the legislators, right? The executive is drawn out of the legislature, hence they function collectively. Unlike in the presidential system, what we see, a strict separation of executive and legislature happens. In a parliamentary system, on the other hand, there is an interdependence between legislature and executive, a point that I have in fact explained you. Now, when we look at the polity such as President of United States of America in United States of America, where there is a presidential system, what exactly do we see? What we see is that president, in fact, would need to find ways in which it is able to lobby the parliamentarians to vote for the bill which he wants to be executed. Thus, he needs to find ways in which he is able to talk to them, in which he is able to connect with them. And the point is that executive functioning is totally away from the legislature. So legislators themselves do not have a big reason to support president on matters. But in parliamentary system like that in India, what we see is that broadly whatever the cabinet is deciding, that thing is getting implemented for the reason that cabinet comes from a party which is in majority in the house. Thus, there is a great chance, there is a high chance that whatever they are deciding, even on legislative matters, will get passed in the house itself. I hope this point is also clear. This example is also clear that in parliamentary system, propensity of a legislative act to get passed also depends on the wishes of the cabinet, right? What is the second advantage of parliamentary system of government? The principle of collective responsibility is present in parliamentary form. As such, they get accountable for all its action. Let me explain this point. Now, what we have understood here is that in presidential form of government, we have the president, one single entity, to be the head of executive. He is responsible and accountable for everything and anything which is happening with respect to the executive domain of functioning. But when we talk about parliamentary system, We have the office of Prime Minister, who is not the sole authority of executive, but in fact it is the council of ministers and then the cabinet which is responsible with respect to executive functioning of the country. Thus, what we see is that while Prime Minister is head of the Council of Ministers, it is not he who is responsible for the actions taken with respect to Ministry of Home Affairs. If there is a Minister of Home Affairs, if there is a Finance Minister will be responsible with respect to his actions, his ministry's performance, and this Council of Ministry collectively will be responsible to the Parliament for the actions of the government. This is different from that of presidential form, where the president is responsible to the Congress or the parliament in order to justify the actions taken by the executive. Thus, what we see that an element of collective responsibility can be seen, and there is higher degree of accountability for the actions taken by the government, for the actions taken by the executive. Coming to the third point, a parliamentary system of government is headed by a cabinet. This results in dispersal of authority and checks despotism and dictatorial tendencies. This again is a pretty straightforward point. Let me just explain it with an example. When we look at a country where there exists presidential form, essentially we have a person who is the head of executive and he decides on all executive decision making. But in parliamentary system, it will be the council of ministers and the cabinet who would decide on the executive decision making. So there is always a threat, there is always a danger in presidential form that the person who has become the head, the person who is the head of the executive, that person might actually become bit brazen in his actions, may become bit despotic in his action, and this is a threat to the polity itself. But when we talk about parliamentary system, this danger is relatively very less because there are number of ministers who are functioning. There is a council which is functioning with respect to functioning of executive division of the polity. Thus, tendencies of despotism or dictatorial tendencies will get checked in parliamentary system. Again, a very important point for us to keep in mind. There is always a scope for an alternative government that can replace the present government. This prevents the need for fresh election in case of fall of the government. Now, students, when we look at the system of parliamentary government, what we see is that if the party which is in power right now is not able to prove its majority, and some other party claims that it now has the number to prove its majority, essentially what will happen is the previous government will fall, while the other government can claim its power, claim itself on the power of forming the government, right? Exactly, this is exactly what has happened with respect to the case of Madhya Pradesh, where there was Congress government. This Congress was able to claim the power because it showed that it has the confidence of the Legislative Assembly. But now we know that it wasn't able to prove the confidence, it wasn't able to show on the floor of the House that it has the support of majority of legislative members. On the other hand, BJP was able to do so. As such, what happened? BJP claimed power and it formed the new government. So what we see that there was no reason for the election commission to conduct fresh elections because now a different party is able to claim the confidence of the house and is now able to form the government. I hope this point is also clear. Now, is it that there are only advantages with respect to parliamentary system? Certainly not. There are in fact certain disadvantages with respect to parliamentary system of governance. What exactly are these disadvantages? Let's try to understand them one by one. The first is the concern of stability in a parliamentary system. Why? For the simple reason that whenever a parliamentary system of polity is functioning, what we may have is a coalition government. That is, it's not one party which is able to find 50% or more than that majority in the floor of the house. It does take support of smaller parties collectively who they claim that a coalition of these four, five, six parties are able to have more than 50% of the members in the floor of the house. So what has happened? That while we are able to find a way in which a government is getting formed, this government in itself inherently is very unstable because if any of these coalition members decides to defect away, essentially the government would fall. Thus, the stability of this government will be dependent on coalition politics more than what exactly needs to be done for the welfare of the people. This again is a reason why parliamentary system of government is known to be bit unstable. But something of this sort cannot happen when we talk about presidential form, because in presidential form, moment a president gets elected, that president will continue to be in office for the whole tenure. As such, stability will certainly be there with respect to presidential form of government as compared to parliamentary system. Of course, a point to note here is that in examples that we see currently in India, where one party is able to get more than 50% of the votes, 50% of the seats in the house, they will always have stability for the reason there is no way in which the government can fall. So this again is something that must be kept in mind, that the stability in a parliamentary system the issue comes about only when we talk about a coalition dynamics and only when we come talk about coalition politics, right? Now, the second point, long term policy formulation is not feasible in a parliamentary system. This is due to uncertainty of tenure. So, this is an extension of the first point itself. When you are trying to work a coalition government, essentially you are trying to consider coalition factors, you are trying to keep your coalition partners, smaller parties happy. As such, they cannot really plan ahead, because whatever small policy they may be trying to make for a long term purpose, it may have short term disadvantages, and this may not be liked by smaller parties. As such, at times what we see is that managing coalition partners in itself becomes the end of the functioning of a government, because all they want is to be in power, stay in power, while welfareism of the people becomes secondary to it. Now, certainly, this is not true in an holistic sense. For the reason what we have seen is that even coalition government has functioned well in the past, be it the time of Atal Bihari Vajpayee or for that matter during the time of Dr. Manmohan Singh. So it is not like it will always be the case, but certainly one can make a case of it that because of coalition dynamics, the government will be more busy to please their coalition partners than to be worrying about long-term policy making. Then the third point, that in parliamentary system, the legislature and executive are together and inseparable. Now, one of the things that we had spoken in the last module of democracy was the fact that what we require is a way in which we are able to separate the three organs: legislature, executive, judiciary. The reason why we need to separate them is because that will ensure that there is no kind of abuse of authority which is happening if one organ is getting to exercise powers of the other. But when we talk about parliamentary system, while one can see that there is a difference between legislator and an executive, but the fact that executives are being drawn from the legislators itself, and the fact that every executive does not forego his capacity of being a legislator. For example, Amit Shah, who is the Home Minister, is also a legislator, is also an MP. So whenever a bill is tabled, he, in his capacity of a legislator, can vote upon it. Thus, what we see that in a parliamentary system, this separation is not absolute. In a parliamentary system, legislators are also acting as executives, and in their capacity of acting as executive, they are not foregoing their right to vote on legislative matters. Then, coming to the fourth point, another concern is qualification of the representatives. In a parliamentary system, ministers need not have specific educational technical qualifications of the concerned ministry, and thus there is a lack of expertise. Let me explain this point, and this point can actually be explained if we try to understand the system or presidential system. So, what exactly happens in a country like USA? We elect the president. Now, this president will create his cabinet where he can get experts of respective fields to be his secretary for that department. For example, he can get a person who has a military background and make him Secretary of Defense. He can get a person who has a background of agriculture and he can make him a Secretary of Agriculture. But something of similar sort cannot necessarily happen in parliamentary system, for the reason that prime minister would need to find a minister within the elected representative. As such, it is not necessary for for the Minister of Defense to have any kind of defense expertise. It is not necessary for a person who is Minister of Information Technology to have any kind of expertise in information technology, or for that matter, a Minister of HRD to be a very highly educated or qualified person. This again is one of the disadvantages of parliamentary system. Students, this is all we had for this lecture. We have discussed about democracy, basics of constitution, and in this lecture we have also discussed about parliamentary system. For more such videos, please log on to scholar.in.